Welcome back to the Budding Author Podcast with me, Simon Ward. Today's guest, the one and only J.D. Barker, suspense thriller writer, New York Times bestseller. Quite a good success rate so far, J.D.
It's been crazy. It's been a wild ride. I just had my 10-year anniversary back in November. Actually, I guess we're coming up on 11 years now as a full-time author. But it's been wild.
What were you doing before you switched to full-time?
Oh, I was doing everybody's dream job. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. That is as horrible as it sounds.
That doesn't sound very exciting at all.
No, honestly, it's like being internal affairs at a police department or being responsible for lost luggage at the airport. It's one of those jobs everybody, they're glad you're there when they need you, but otherwise they don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah, I can imagine. What when did you first start writing? What got you into writing to start with?
I've been doing it pretty much my entire life. I grew up without a TV in the house, and this is the 70s, so that doesn't mean much. We only had 3 channels anyway, but we would go to the library all the time. So I was reading by the time I was 3 years old, and by the time I got into kindergarten, I'd read like all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and moved on to Charles Dickens and stuff like that. I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me, so I would write stories, just make stuff up, and I would staple the pages together, and I created a little library in my room, and she'd check them out, and I charge her late fees. And that's basically when it started. So I've been doing it pretty much my entire life. But it's one of those things. My parents encouraged it as a hobby, and they always added that caveat. It's a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So they drilled that into my head. So I did what I was told to do. I finished up school. I went off to college, got a couple degrees, ended up working behind a desk, hated every second of it.
It's to get to a position where you can sort of switch to it full time. That is sort of like a magical point. Back in 2014, when you published your first novel, Forsaken, got the Bram Stoker Award finalist, weren't you, for that? Was that a bit of a shock to you, or was you quite liking the idea when you went into it?
It was pretty wild. Stephen King read that book and before it was published, and he let me use some of his characters from Needful Things in it. And that was huge. That's basically what kicked off my career. Just word of mouth of that happening. Publishers Weekly wrote about it. So it basically lit the fuse, I think, and got it all started.
So how did you get Stephen King to read it?
Oh, that's a fun story. And I advise everybody not to do this. So I in the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to get that finished manuscript done, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things and bought it there, and fully expected to have to change that because you can't do that kind of thing without a bunch of lawyers jumping on you. But my wife read it. She's way smarter than me. She said, before we cut it, let's just try and get his permission. So I researched it a little bit, and turned out King had a house in Florida about 10 minutes from my mom's house. So when we were down there visiting her, we printed up the manuscript, we hopped in the car, and we figured, well, we'll head over to Steve's house. Maybe we'll catch him outside gardening or something, hand him the manuscript. He'll give us a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way. It didn't work out that way. So King lives on a little island off the coast called Casey Key. You go over a tiny little bridge. If you make a left, you go to like the public portion of this island where the restaurants and bars and hotels and stuff are. If you make a right, you basically hit the entire half of the island that Stephen King owns. There's immediately a private drive sign and no trespassing sign. There was a gate and then another gate. I got maybe a mile down this road, and I was watching the trees for snipers, thinking this is probably a really bad idea. So we went back to one of the restaurants. I called a friend of mine who knew King. Told him what we were doing, a guy named Dallas Mayer. He passed away a few years ago, but really nice guy. And he said, yeah, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Just email him the book. If it's good, he'll reply. If you don't hear from him, the book is probably shit, but leave him alone. So I sent him the book, and a couple days later, I got an email back, and he said, I love this. Go ahead and use the reference. Let me know if you need anything. It's fantastic. I mean, he's very supportive of new writers.
Did he give you any pointers about your writing, or just
not at that point, but I've bugged him over the years, by email, just asking him questions. To give you an example, I've got a ton of books behind me, but there's only 2 back that are actually on the subject of writing. One of them is Strunk and White, which gives you basically every rule and grammar that you need to know. It's only like a 1/4 inch thick. There's not much to it. And the other one is On Writing, Stephen King's book on the subject. And in that book, he at one point said that he uses past tense for pretty much everything and only uses present tense for works of short fiction. Like he felt that's what they should be used for. And then a couple of years back, he wrote a book called Mr. Mercedes, and the whole book was in present tense. So I emailed him, Steve, what's up? You're contradicting yourself. And he sent me this really long explanation, but it made perfect sense. He said that, typically when he wrote in past tense, if he had to do a flashback scene, he would do the flashback in present tense, just to have that differentiator in there. So the reader's mind would pick up on something different, but it seemed backwards to him. And if you think about it, it kind of does, if you're in present tense and you're jumping back in time, now all of a sudden you're in past, so he switched it up for Mr. Mercedes. He wrote the book in present tense, and for the flashback scenes, he wrote those in past tense. Which makes perfect sense. And, as a reader, you never pick up on it. You don't really notice it, but your brain catches that little bit of a jump in tenses and realizes now we're in the past, now we're back in the present. And it keeps it all making sense. So I've actually been trying to write everything in present tense lately, just because, for the same reasons.
Yeah, I think when I've tried to write in present tense, you start getting into trouble, don't you? It's hard to do.
It's tricky. I just finished a book with James Paterson. And we wrote that one in present tense. And when I first started it, I had just finished a book that was in past tense. So for like the first couple chapters, my brain kept going back to past tense. And, as I went back and did the reread on it to clean it up, I found myself slipping and going back into past. And probably about 3 chapters in, then my brain clicked, oh, we're doing this now. And, then it was all present tense. But now the book I'm working on today is in past tense again. So I have to jump back. And you just put those different hats on. It gets easier, but you have to work at it.
Yeah, it's quite a challenge, really. I've sort of written chapters and then realised, hang on, this is all in first person. It's in present tense. I need to change it all to sort of connect. And I think you have a very strict writing schedule. So I think if you're staying in the moment with it and writing consistently, it's easier with that. I think for me, where I'm sort of might be a few days before I'm back to writing something, then that's difficult. I suppose you've got it easier that way because you're staying in the zone, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in your position too. Back when I was working the full-time job, I would write whenever I could. So, you squeeze out a couple hundred words here, a few more there. In line at the grocery store, any chance I got to write, I would write. But there's these tiny little 200 words, 150 words. A couple days goes by and you have to you write another 100 words. That's tough. In today's world, I write full time. I get up first thing in the morning. I hit the computer straight off the bat. I do 2,000 to 3,000 words or so by about 10:30. Just nonstop. And then I basically have the words done for the day. I kind of flip the switch for the business side of things and start looking at emails and dealing with my agents and everything else. But it's much easier when you're doing it full time.
No procrastination for you then?
No, we talked a little bit before you hit the record button. I'm autistic. I've got a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome. And for better or worse, it makes me very productive. I get a task in front of me and I have to complete that task before I can move on to something else. If you've seen it in movies, one of the best movies I think on autism, and it seems kind of silly, but it's a Ben Affleck movie called The Accountant. He's a hitman, but he's autistic. And like the beats that they used to demonstrate the autism side of him are perfect. They are spot on. And there's a scene at the beginning where he's walking through a room with other autistic kids and they're doing puzzles. And if you take a puzzle away from an autistic kid before they get to finish, like they will have a complete meltdown. And that is exactly how I am. If you put a puzzle or task in front of me, I have to finish it before I can move on to something else. So it makes me productive, but it's a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, there's so many distractions. I think for me, for my writing, if I have anything else on my to-do list, I can't really sort of get into the mood and get into the vision to write. I need to, if I've got a list of 5 things for the day, I need to finish 4 of them before I get onto the writing, sort of, which makes it a challenge to be able to get to the writing on a consistent basis. But I need to have everything else clear so I can really sort of focus into things.
Yes, I honestly, I deal with it the opposite way. I mentioned I start writing at 7. I turn off the internet when I first get in my office. So I literally don't look at anything else until I get those words done.
Yeah.
Just because, just to keep those kind of things from happening. So once the words are finished, I feel like I've accomplished that task, and then I can move on and deal with all the other, things that I have to do for the day.
But I guess when you're working and that sort of stuff, you'd have to deal with that somehow differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's my full-time job now. I've got deadlines I've got to meet. I've got people that I'm working with. I do a lot of collaborations and co-authored stuff. So everything, I'm kept on task. Like I could never turn in something late. Like that is just not something ingrained in me. So I'll work as hard as I have to get it done.
Tell me more about that. The collaborations. How did that start? Obviously, working with James Paterson is a huge deal. But how did all the collaborations work? How did that, and the actual process of the collaboration? How does that work?
I've honestly back when I was working the corporate job, I used to come home and I would work on writing projects at night. That was kind of how I stayed sane. And a lot of those were collaborations. I was working with other people. I wrote a lot of memoirs for other people. I worked as what I called a book doctor for a long time. People would send me manuscripts that were half baked or needed work, and I would clean them up. So for all of those things that I was working on, all those projects, I was essentially collaborating with other people. I did that for 23 years. So when I actually sat down to write Forsaken, my first novel all by myself, that felt weird because all of a sudden I'm the only person in the room. So I have worked with, hundreds of different people on various projects over the years. Everyone is completely different. And I think the easiest way to look at it, if you've got two people in the kitchen making breakfast and one person is making eggs and the other person is making bacon, everything works out perfectly. But if you both try to make eggs at the same time, then it becomes a problem. So it's really important straight off the bat to figure out everybody's strengths and weaknesses and then focus on those.
So who would generally do the majority of the writing then for that?
Again, it's always different. When I was doing the book doctor stuff, a lot of times they would give me a manuscript that had a full story, beginning, middle, and an end. But I would have to take out, let's say, 30,000 words, or I'd have to rewrite all of their dialogue. So a lot of editing and stuff involved in that. Like working with somebody like James Paterson, I mean, we just finished up book 6, and I don't think a single one has actually been like the same process. The very first one we did, Coast to Coast Murders, we actually did without an outline. I'm the only person who's ever gotten James Paterson to write a book without an outline. But we went back and forth. I would write a chapter and paint him into some kind of crazy scenario, thinking he's never going to get out of this. I'd send him the pages, and 15 minutes later, he'd send me new pages. And not only did he get out of it, but he put me in an even worse position. And we went back and forth through the whole book like that. And it's the twistiest novel I think I've ever written.
That was fun. Good. Did was one of you a certain point of view and the other one was a different character, or
no, we both wrote everything. One of the things that being autistic has given me, I don't know if you have any autistic people in your life, but we tend to mimic other people. So like if we're in a social situation, let's say at a party, and somebody cracks a joke, I'm going to laugh at that joke because the people around me are laughing at it, not necessarily because I particularly find it funny. But I've learned to mimic other people in those kind of situations. And something that I learned a long time ago is I can mimic other people on paper. So if you put somebody's words in front of me, that's something somebody else wrote, I can read that and I'll pick up on their vocabulary, their writing style, their cadence, and I can continue that story in their voice, which is something that's proven to be very useful when working with other people.
You have said previously that the autism is like a superpower for you, and that does very much seem like that. That's awesome. You still write short stories. What's your mindset around that? Is that something you feel that you need to do to keep yourself fresh on that side of things, or is it just a break from the novels?
It's a little bit of a break. I mean, honestly, if you've ever tried writing a short story, I think it's harder to write a short story than it is to write a novel, because you've got to, establish your characters very quickly. You've got to get your story down on paper, in a couple thousand words instead of 80,000 words. You've got to learn to be very clear and concise. And I've, when I've taught other people how to write, a lot of times I'll start them with short stories just to make sure they get those points across.
Yeah, I had that actually. Laura Frost had been on my show, and she focuses a lot on short stories. And I thought I should get back into short stories. So I'd looked at a writing competition for short stories, and it was 2,500 words. So I'd done this story, and it was around about 2,700. So I thought I'll probably just tighten this up. And then when I went to submit it, it was actually 1,500, not 2,500. So that's take another 1,000 words out of it. But I mean the cut and cut again is it's good technique and good practice for novel writing, isn't it? As well, sort of to keep things nice and tight.
Yeah, I mean, solid writing is actually created in the editing process. I think it's Hemingway that originally said that, and he probably stole it from somebody else. For me, I've always overwritten. So I'll write maybe 160,000 words on a book, and then I'll take 40 to 60,000 words out of that book before it's done. And it's almost like getting a good piece of meat, a steak or something from the grocery store, and then you trim the fat away, and you just keep going until you get down to the leanest piece of meat, and then throw it on the grill. To me, a story is very much like that. It's a lot easier to take words out of a story than it is to beef one up. Back when I worked as a book doctor, I used to have to do that. Somebody would write a 50,000 word novel. They call it a novel, but at the time the publishers wouldn't put it out unless it was at least 80. So we'd have to add to it. It's always more difficult to fill in those scenes and try and beef them up to the point where you can add words. But taking away has never been a problem.
For my writing, I sort of pretty much stick to the story plot line and let that run away. And as we all do, the characters sort of take over and write the story for you. I have to go back and put in description. I just stick to the dialogue line and the specific stage direction sort of thing. I have to go back in and put in sort of descriptions. I think, is that normal? It's probably not the way you do things, perhaps, but I mean, is that?
Yeah, no, it's very normal. I mean, a lot of times, just to get a book started, I feel you have to know your characters extremely well. They have to be fleshed out and be, almost like real people to you before you can start writing.
Yeah.
If you've got three characters in front of you and you ask them all the same question, you should get three different answers because they should be three different people. One of the things I used to do, though, just a quick and dirty way to get a book started is I would base characters on actors. So I would say that this character is like so and so, this character is like so and so, and if you take somebody, let's say like Morgan Freeman, you know his vocal patterns, the way he moves, the way everything about him, so it just kind of saves you that particular step. So I would start the books like that, and then I'd get maybe about a third of the way in, and then those characters basically become their own selves. And then I would finish up the book, and then when I get to the end, I go back to the beginning and kind of adjust that early stuff to match what I figured out later on, particularly with dialogue. I think that's where it's really key.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of dialogue. I think that's probably one of my strengths, I would think. Maybe if you read my stuff, you'd probably say different. But I find sort of tight dialogue sort of quite comfortable for me. But sort of description is something that perhaps doesn't come to me so well. When I focus on it, I can write nice descriptions and be very descriptive. But in my normal sort of cadence of writing, I don't want to be distracted by sort of a lengthy description.
Yeah, no, I've actually found that it's better to put less of a description in. Let's say you've got a character and one of the things that a lot of writers do is they'll immediately tell you what this person is wearing, what they look like. None of that is necessary for the story. But they feel the need to put it out there. But the problem that you run into is as soon as a reader is going through that story, they read that very first line of dialogue, their brain has already figured out what they think that person looks like, what they sound like, what they're wearing. So if, a paragraph later you tell them, and what you tell them is something different than what they've already come up with on their own, you basically take them out of the story. So I found that it's better to just put little snippets, drop little hints here and there. Make sure you use all five senses. Make sure you mention smell sometime, taste, sight, sound, everything. But just little pieces, just enough to trigger those things in the reader's brain and let them fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I have a part of my checklist is to, after I've done my first draft, when I'm going back through, it'll be description, and the senses is sort of an area I sort of look at. It's my the novel I'm currently working on. My sister, she's used to be a librarian, and she had a read of it, and her criticism, like not your typical sister supportive family. This is sort of this is a very harsh criticism. But she said, you haven't said how old the character is, and you haven't described the character. And I'm like, I need to. When you read the story, you'll understand. It'll all come to light. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you can, there's different ways to do it. A lot of times you can use a character's name to establish how old they are. If I
Yeah,
say a female named Harriet, we're immediately going to go to an older woman in our brain.
yeah,
Because it's just not a name that people associate with younger people. So there's
yeah.
ways to do that. I mean, I always backtrack when I'm creating the characters. I'll figure out, okay, I've got a male. He's this, and he's black, he's white, he's whatever. He's this old, and then I'll figure out where he was born, and then I'll look up. Okay, he was born in Wales. He's 32 years old. What male names were popular 32 years ago
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Wales? And you do that, and then it's a real easy way to fill in some of those blanks. You don't want to overshare. It's really important just to get into the story as quickly as possible. Just give enough detail to get away with it. One of the exercises I used to do for myself, and when I worked with students, Stephen King has always been a go-to of mine to just learn how to do various things. If you pick up a collection of his short stories, go through and highlight anytime he introduces a new character, and you'll find that he can build a complete person inside of about 3 sentences every single time. And once you see that, if you highlight it and you start seeing it over and over again, you can pick up on how he's doing it. And he's not reinventing the wheel. He's hitting 1 or 2 things that are just very distinctive about that person. He gets them out on paper very quickly, minimal number of words, and then we're right back into dialogue or whatever else is going on. And that's the way to do it. You don't want to have like a snippet of dialogue and then 2 paragraphs describing who this person is, and then go back into the conversation. You've got to weed it all in there. It's bam, bam, bam. It's got to happen fast.
I think I saw some advice from a Stephen King thing, and I think he described an IT guy as oily, which
but that's going to stick in your brain. It immediately creates a picture.
That's it. Fantastic. The Dracula 2018, that was another Superior Achievement Award nomination. Tell me about Dracula.
Yeah, so Bram Stoker actually lost the Bram Stoker Award.
Have I said that right?
That particular year. I think we lost to Paul Tremblay. I was there for Forsaken. It was nominated for the best debut horror novel. I forget what year that was. But while I was there, I sat next to Dacre Stoker at a book signing, and Dacre is Bram's great-grandnephew. And we talked for about an hour. I hit him up, for tons of information on Bram Stoker and picked his brain. And he started asking me about my history as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. I didn't know it at the time, but it was actually a job interview. He pulled me aside the next day and he said, listen, I'm going to be honest with you. My family's been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a while now, using Bram's original notes. And is it something you would be interested in doing? And the answer to that question is yes. It's always yes when somebody asks you that. And that was a fantastic project. He sprung 2 things on me that really hooked me. He told me that Bram firmly believed in vampires to the point where when he died, he had himself cremated at a time in history when people didn't do that. And the original tale of Dracula, he wrote as a true story. He wanted people to understand what he thought was real. He wanted to get that point across. He turned in the book to his editor. His editor pushed it back across the desk and said, there's no way we can publish this. It's going to scare people too much. This was a time in history when Jack the Ripper was active. People believed in the paranormal. But ultimately, Bram needed the money. So like the second thing that Dacre told me is, we think of Dracula as starting with Jonathan Harker on the train. That's actually page 103 of the original manuscript. They made him take the first 102 pages out, the section that was very autobiographical and basically explained why he felt vampires were real. So the story that we decided to tell with Dracula recreated those first 100-some pages, basically told the story that Bram was trying to tell originally.
And that was very successful, obviously. And you got film followed as that as well.
It's been optioned over and over again. They still haven't made anything. When the book was up for publication, we had a bunch of publishers that wanted it. So Dacre and we hopped in that. I took a train. I think he flew in, but we were in New York for a couple of days, and we went to I think 6 or 7 different publishers that all wanted the books. And while we were in the car going between those publishers, we were on the phone with the film and TV studios and our agent for that front. And it ended up selling in all those different things all at the same time. Ultimately, Paramount bought it. They attached attached Andy Muschietti to direct, who was most known for doing It for Stephen King, which was fantastic at the time. But one of the things that we learned later is that Andy had a very long list of things that he was attached to. So anytime he finished up a project, he would look at that very long list and he would pick what he wanted to do next. 1 out of 20 or 30 different things. If he didn't pick your book, in our case, Dracula, it basically stayed on that list until he was ready to do something else. And it also meant that nobody else could touch it because it was tied to Andy and Paramount. So they renewed that option a couple of times. They finally let it go. It's currently in development as a series, so we'll see if that happens. I've got 8 different projects in what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. Like nothing has actually been filmed yet. But like everything is kind of like slowly moving closer to that. My 4MK series just got optioned for the 4th time. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the winner. Somebody once told me, if you watch the credits at the end of a movie, 6 minutes of just names going by, scrolling by, all of those people had to be there for that movie to actually make it to the screen. You take one person away and all of a sudden it doesn't happen. And that is literally how Hollywood works. All these things have to come together in a perfect storm.
Yeah, some challenges there. I want to talk specifically on writing and foreshadowing and how you put that into your writing, sort of to hold your reader in full suspense. What sort of techniques have you got that you could share with us about that?
A lot of the foreshadowing that I do in my books, I do after the fact. Like you had mentioned, going back and cleaning things up in the earlier parts of the draft. I'll go back and I add little snippets here or there to foreshadow things that, are coming down the road. Because a lot of times you don't know what they are, at that point when you're writing them, but you figure it out 300 pages later. So you can go back to page 80 and you can plant a scene here, you can plant something there. So I do that quite a bit. One of the things that I learned working with Paterson, that makes perfect sense now looking at it. As a writer, when you're writing a chapter, your brain immediately creates a beginning, a middle, and end to that chapter. Like we want to close out the chapter with something, to kind of tie it up in a nice little bow. But if you're writing thrillers, that's the last thing you want to do. You want people to have to turn that page to figure out what comes next. So one of the things I'll do on a second draft is I'll go through every chapter and take away, maybe the last sentence or the last paragraph, or something that basically causes it to end on a cliffhanger instead of having that final, that closure. A lot of times you can, take it out altogether. Sometimes you move it to the beginning of the next chapter, but just making that little bit of a change is enough to keep people flipping those pages.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, I guess, to keep them flipping.
Yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of beta readers. I give them printed copies of all of my books, and there's a couple instructions that I give them, but 2 that are key for me. Anytime they skim anything in the text, I ask them to highlight it. I want to know what they're skimming over. And if multiple people are skimming the same section, I know I've got a problem. I know I've got to take it out or change it in some way. But the other thing I ask them to do is to mark anytime they close that book. Just fold the page and mark where they do it. And I don't care if it's because they have to go pick up the kids at school or they've got to make dinner, or they've got to go to work. I don't care what the reason is. I just want to know where they felt it was okay to close that book and put it down. And I look at that very closely. And if I see multiple people, putting a book down in the same place, again, I'll do a rewrite to try and take away whatever it is that is creating that, that little lull where they think they can do that. I want people to have to read it cover to cover.
Yeah, it's nice to keep pulling people in, isn't it? The having the cliffhanger moments, if you have those at the end of each chapter, is that a bit too much?
I don't think so, but I think it depends on the types of books you're writing. Like I write suspense thrillers. People expect, something like that. If there's no action in the first, couple pages, sometimes the first couple paragraphs, thriller readers will get bored, because they're used to seeing it. So I try to keep as many cliffhangers in there as I can. I go with very short chapters, only 1,000 to maybe 1,500 words at the most. I want them to be able to keep going and going and going. I want them to feel like, they'll read a 500-page book, but it's going to fly by.
Yeah. I think that's the challenge. I think for a lot of my reading, lengthy chapters do sort of drag me down a little bit. Really, I like the fast-paced elements. So like similarly, my chapters are generally sort of around the 1,800 word sort of 2,500 word sort of level. I like to just keep things moving and chopping forward. But it's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge to
It is, but it's fun. I mean, and there's different ways to do it. You know, like the pacing is extremely important. You know, so a short chapter, you know, it feels like the story is moving faster if you give them a short chapter versus a long chapter. If you want them to take a breather, you can do the long chapter. But it goes further than that. You know, if you've got a scene that you want to move quickly, you know, you use short sentences, you use short paragraphs, a lot of white space on that page. They may be reading half the words. You know, a typical page may have 250 words on it. You know, a fast-paced chapter might have 100 words on it. But that causes the reader to flip that page very, very quickly. They feel like the story is moving very fast, and you can control the speed that they read the book if you do it properly.
Yeah, that's where dialogue can sort of help sort of keep the pace moving fast. If it's punchy dialogue, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, we think of real people. You know, if you're in the middle of a fight scene, if you're running, trying to get away from something, you're not going to be speaking in complete sentences. Everything's going to be broken. You're going to be breathing in between. You're going to be doing this in between. You're going to, you know, misspeak quite a bit because your brain's not thinking about what you're saying. It's thinking about getting you out of that particular scenario. All those things would happen in real life. So you've got to make sure you communicate it on paper as well.
Yeah. Where'd you get all your ideas from for your stories?
Oh, I have no idea. I literally don't. Like I've got an app on my phone, a Word document called Ideas. You know, anytime I get something, I just drop it in there. But you know, they come from all kinds of, you know, random places. I'll give you an example. So I had a book about a year and a half ago called Behind a Closed Door. For the longest time, I had two characters in my idea file that I wanted to write about. It was a husband named Brendan and Abby Hollander, husband and wife. I knew I wanted to start them, you know, in a therapist office. I knew I wanted them to, you know, be somehow having some type of difficulty in their marriage. But like that was going to be the catalyst. I didn't know where I was going to go from there, but like I knew I wanted to do that. And that sat in there for a couple of years. And then one night, my wife and I, we were sitting around at the dinner table just talking. She does a lot of real estate investing, and she had just bought a house in Georgia. It was a pretty big house. It had, I think, 7 bathrooms in it. And she was telling me that she had to do a renovation on the whole place. And just, you know, as part of the conversation, I mentioned this company called Bath Fitters. I don't know if you have them over there, but here in the States, it's one of these companies. They come in one day and they'll completely, you know, do a cosmetic refit of your bathroom. So we just kind of talked about that, but that's all we did was talk about it. And then that night, we both noticed on our phones and on television, we started seeing commercials for Bath Fitters. So I researched this a little bit and realized that in the terms of service for our phones, that we basically allow them to listen to everything that's going on. So right now my iPhone is sitting over here on the table. Yeah, it's listening to every word that you and I are saying. It's grabbing particular keywords out of the air, and it's going to use that to target market me later on. So I started thinking about that, you know, like how can I use that in a story? And then I bounced, you know, going through my idea folder, saw Brendan and Abby, and I realized I could tie it all together. So, you know, we go back to Brendan and Abby. They're in the therapist office. They're, you know, Brendan basically has he almost cheats. He comes very close, but he doesn't. But they realize they've got a problem, which is why they're at the therapist office. They want their marriage to work, so they're trying to come up with a way to keep it all together. The therapist recommends that they download an app called Sugar and Spice to their phones. It's basically Truth or Dare for adults. To kind of spice up their marriage. So they go home and do that. But what they don't realize is this particular app, the second they download it, it gets access to everything else on their phone. Their other apps, their emails, their everything else that they've got. And if you think about everything that you've got on your phone, it knows everything about you. It knows where you've been. It knows where you're going. It knows your schedule. It knows what you look at, what you like, what you don't like. So they use all of that information, which is not very different from what happens in real life. But I paired those two ideas together, and then that became the catalyst for Behind a Closed Door.
Okay. And that one hit the screen as well, didn't it? Or was that one being optioned, does it?
It's been optioned. It's in development. They've got a director and a writer, and they're, I think, on the second draft of the screenplay at this point. It's moving pretty fast.
So when you say screenplay, so have you got involved in screenwriting, or is that you just hand that over to someone else for that?
I did that once. You know, so I got a little cocky a couple of books in. So I think I was about on my 4th or 5th book. I was writing a book called A Caller's Game. And up until that point, everything had been optioned. So while I was writing Caller's Game, I figured I'm going to try to write something that they can't possibly film just to see what happens. So in this book, I blow up like half of New York. I'm like, there's no way they're going to film this. As soon as the book came out, it immediately got optioned by Ridley Scott's company. They're like, we could film this. Apparently you can blow up half of New York. It's just very expensive. But they love the story. Then at one point they asked if I wanted to write the screenplay. So I figured I'd give it a try. I'd never done a screenplay before. So I sat down and I wrote my script. And when I was finished, my movie was 4.5 hours long. Which obviously doesn't work. But like, I didn't know what to take out, because when I wrote the book, I basically took out everything I felt didn't need to be there, so now the story is the story. So my story is 4.5 hours long.
Yeah, that's it. You can't take it out, can you? That's the problem.
No, so I turned that in, and I didn't think anything was going to go with it. They hired somebody else, and they were looking at a feature film, then they were looking at a series. But recently they've circled back because in today's world, a feature film can be 4.5 hours long.
Yeah,
it'll come, it'll come out on Netflix, be 2 or 3 parts. So they're able to tell that story, and that's something that wasn't, a possibility, just a handful of years ago. So these things come around, but I mean, in all honesty, like, I like writing the books. I enjoy writing the books. I didn't have any fun at all writing a screenplay. And I don't see myself doing that again. I'm going to leave that to the people that like doing it.
Yeah. I get it. I did that I'd written a series, and I sort of did a script for the first one, and it is torturous doing that. I think it's best to get somebody else and collaborate with someone else to finish that for you. I think. JT.
I'm sorry, you just cut out there. I missed that.
Directly behind you, can you see that? Or maybe that is.
You just came back. You cut out for a second there. I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I can see just behind you. Is that your latest book? What's that?
Yeah, that's something I keep upstairs. That's another fun one where weird ideas kind of came together. In that folder that I mentioned, I had a tagline for a book. I knew I wanted to write a haunted house story, but I didn't want to write that same haunted house story that we've heard over and over again. Husband and wife buy a house, it's a fixer-upper, they move in, something bad happens, something worse happens, they realize something really bad happened, and then they deal with all that, and then hopefully you've got a happy ending. I didn't want to tell that story because it's been done to death. So I started digging into haunted houses, and like, one story that I found that has never actually been told is what I basically came up with here. So the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So in my story, a 17-year-old kid inherits a house from his grandmother. He didn't know her or anything, but she passed away and she left him this house. So he's 17 years old. All of a sudden he's got a house. Him and his friends do exactly what you would expect them to do. They turn it into a party house. Just like any 17-year-old would do. But after a while, they get bored. Or they get bored doing that. So somebody raises their hand and say, hey, what would it take to turn this house into a haunted house? It's a perfectly normal house. What would it take? So they start exactly where you would expect. There's a Ouija board. They tell each other a couple of scary stories, but things escalate. And the whole time you're reading it, the tagline for the book, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So where they're going, but the book is all about the journey to get there.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. JD, this has been a great pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show. And I know you've got a busy schedule and you've got places to be. So just want to thank you for coming on the show. The Budding Author Podcast on YouTube and on audio podcast. So you can get it on both. And that's been brilliant. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.